Well, hello everyone, and welcome to McDuff Lives. It's December the 1st, and happy December to everyone. 11:04 a.m. here on the East Coast of the United States, where we have Eastern Standard Time, and I hate having to make that adjustment. I don't know about you, but it just gets dark too early now. Anyway, good morning, David, and thank you very much for a fascinating show on exchange last night with Nick and myself. Good morning to It Happens and Corky, and thanks for joining me on rather short notice. I Just because of an opportunity to do something else tonight, I wanted to go ahead and do my Mindfields this morning and to explore something I wanted to do for a long time. And this has to do with my overall project of trying to understand the the parties, the great divisions in the United States, and historically understand the roots of things. Of course, the Civil War is a great place to find division in the country. But then after the Civil War, we had very competing interests. Some of them wanted to pursue the abolitionist dream of educating the Southern blacks and bringing them up to speed and integrating them into the mainstream and the economy. But very few people actually supported following through with that. And politically, the power in the South still rested with the owners of the great plantations, and that just didn't happen. So instead of that, we had another 50 years or so of Jim Crow, and it is Edwin Mandell House that provides the iconic example of someone who wanted Jim Crow, who wanted to keep the black folks of the South virtually enslaved through ignorance and poverty. And the underlying idea behind racism is the same underlying idea behind eugenics. And that is that, there are certain people that are of a better strain of genetics than other people. And in times, you have to cull the lesser genetic qualified herd. And otherwise, when you need labor, you just use them for labor. And it can extend to the Nazi idea of working to death, slave labor until they are dead. Of course, that's not just a Nazi idea. If you imagine, historically, a- anybody that got enslaved could easily end up rowing a galley for their last year or two of drawing breath. And then when they're dead, they're thrown overboard and replaced by another slave. And rowing galleys was the way that the powers of the ancient world made their fortunes. And, there's no greater example than Venice. And then you take from Venice, you go to Amsterdam and London and Wall Street, and that financial empire continues growing and extending its tentacles into every aspect of our lives. Um, so here we are, we're approaching some transition into a new world order of some kind, whether Klaus Schwab gets his ideal or not. Clearly, technology is way ahead of humanity, and the technological influence and the ability to influence our thinking is quite real and present right now. So, how do we fix it? How do we get back to being, real humans and having a human life and, what I think most people expect that America was built to preserve? And how do we get back to it? Well, As I said at the beginning of the show, I feel that there are certain major trends in our history, and one of them is certainly the trend between the agricultural dream and the commercial dream. And I think that is drawn very, very well in the little novel called Philip Drew Administrator, written by Colonel Edward Mandell House. And read a little about Edward Mandell House. Look at his Wikipedia. You can see that he grew up in a plantation in the South during the Civil War and afterwards, and was one of the primary racists of the world at that time because he had money and he had profited his father's business of running guns for cotton in the ports of Texas and through Mexico, and financing and building a railroad in Texas. The wealth that he commanded was substantial. He went to New York and became an advisor to Woodrow Wilson, then the governor of New Jersey, in his bid to be the president in the first half of the 19 teens. So that kind of brings us into the time period that we're going to be discussing this morning. It's 1912, all right, 1912, and Woodrow Wilson is getting prepared for a bid for the presidency. Edward Mandell House is one of his advisors, and they're both racists, they're absolute white supremacists, no doubt about it. That's not spelled out in the history books, but that's the way we have to look at it because that is a huge effect on the policies that they chose. Nevertheless, they consider themselves to be Democrats. The South, of course, was a solid Democratic bastion of unity up until the mid and late 60s, the Solid South, it was called. And whatever the Democratic leadership wanted, that's what they would vote for. And that included Jim Crow going way back. So, we have this Democratic Party now today, which claims to be the vanguard of anti-racism, but it's founded in the racism of an Edward Mandell House and a Woodrow Wilson and all of the Jim Crow governors and representatives of the Southern and Midwestern and other states. It's not limited to the South, but this idea of a racial division that needed to be maintained, even though we claim to be a democratic republic. The underlying sub rosa understanding that yes, we are democratic. We want to preserve the principles of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. But, as Chief Justice Taney said in the Dred Scott decision, that a Negro has no rights that need to be respected by a white man. He said that in 1850, what, 8 or so? This guy lived, maybe 50 miles from here, just on the other side of the Patuxent River in Calvert County. And, that was his belief. It was his core belief. It was everybody's core belief that you could not allow the mixing of the races because it would, defile the purity of the white race. So 1912, and what else is going on? Well, very soon, D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation is going to be filmed and published. And when Wilson wins, he plays it in the White House, and the revival of the KKK, all of this consistent with the Southern plantation, gone with the wind mentality, which is certainly not gone with the wind. So this tragedy of having the power structures believe in a racial divide that needs to be maintained is part of what Southern Democrats believed and fought for and were told, that they were doing the right thing in things like the birth of the nation. They're the knights in white, and they're going to save civilization from the corruption that comes from the lesser races. It sounds like a crazy Mickey Mouse fantasy, doesn't it? But it's our real history. Nevertheless, you'll be surprised to hear this. I actually like Philip Drew. Philip Drew, the hero of this little novel, very bare bones novel, and it's clearly there for the purposes of providing a introduction to a political platform that Woodrow Wilson is going to end up uh, uh, either incorporating or otherwise influenced by. And who knows? Maybe this whole thing was this book might have been ghost written for Edward Mandell House, and as a political way to seduce the same Southerners that would have loved to go see Birth of the Nation, and a later generation of which finds the Gone with the Wind story to be a very nice and quite acceptable portrait of the history of the South, which of course it's not. But why do I like Philip Drew? Because he is able to give me the picture in a way I can visualize it of the dreams of this 19 teens, 20s generation of young people that think that they have ideas of how to fix things. And that's what happens here. If you look at the Wikipedia or any other, like on Amazon, any just little summaries of the novel, they are going to skip the most important part to me, and that is the beginning, where you get to see his character and who he is, what he really wants to work for. So without having to hold your nose whenever you hear the word, the name Edward Mandell House, let's delve into his writing and just let's reflect on what this represents in terms of the political divide in the country as he describes it. And I think he does a pretty darn good job. So, all right, with that, let me go over to the text, and I'll just carry on from there. So, chapter 1 of the book is called Graduation Day, and it's set at West Point. In the year 1920, the student and the statesman saw many indications that the social, financial, and industrial troubles that had vexed the United States of America for so long a time were about to culminate in civil war. Okay, once again, I meant to explain, it's 1912 when he publishes the book, so it's kind of a science fiction or political fiction book about what's going to happen in 1920 and thereafter, okay? So, wealth had grown so strong that the few were about to strangle the many, and among the great masses of the people there was sullen and rebellious discontent. Okay, that sounds very familiar, does it not? The laborer in the cities, the producer on the farm, the merchant, the professional man, and all save organized capital and its satellites saw a gloomy and hopeless future. With these conditions prevailing, the graduation exercises as a class of 1920 of the National Military Academy at West Point held for many a foreboding promise of momentous changes. But the 12th of June found the usual gay scene at the great institution overlooking the Hudson. The President of the Republic, his Secretary of War, and many other distinguished guests were there to do honor to the occasion, together with friends, relatives, and admirers of the young men who were being sent out to the ultimate leadership of our nation's army. The scene had all the usual charm of West Point graduations and the usual intoxicating atmosphere of military display. There was among the young graduating soldiers one who seemed depressed and out of touch with the triumphant blare of militarism, for he alone of his fellow classmen had there no kith nor kin to bid him Godspeed in his new career. Standing apart under the broad shadow of an oak, he looked out over long stretches of forest and river, but what he saw was his home in distant Kentucky, the old farmhouse that the sun and the rain and the lichens had softened into a mottled gray. He saw the gleaming brook that wound its way through the tangle of orchard and garden and parted the distant bluegrass meadow. Yes, it's the old South. He saw his aged mother sitting under the honeysuckle trellis, book in hand, but thinking he knew of him. And then there was the perfume of the flowers, the droning of the bees in the warm, sweet air, and the drowsy hound at his father's feet. Man, don't you just want to be there? But this was not all the young man saw, for Philip Drew, in spite of his military training, was a close student of the affairs of his country, and he saw that which raised grave doubts in his mind as to the outcome of his career. He saw many of the civil institutions of his country debased by the power of wealth under the thin guise of the constitutional protection of property. Did you hear that? This is Edwin Mandell House, the bad guy, the racist Woodrow Wilson Versailles bad guy sells us out to Great Britain, right? That's the way that we see him. But look what he's saying. He's saying the same thing that many people that went to January 6th were saying. Okay? The civil institutions of our country are being debased by the power of wealth under the thin guise of constitutional protection of property. Corporations. All right, back to the book. He saw the army, which he had sworn to say or serve faithfully, becoming prostituted by the same power and used at times for purposes of intimidation and petty conquests where the interests of wealth were at stake. Hawaii, Philippines, Nicaragua, where else? China. He saw the great city where luxury, dominant and defiant, existed largely by grace of exploitation of men, women, and children. The young man's eyes had become bright and hard when his daydream was interrupted, and he was looking into the gray-blue eyes of Gloria Strawn, the one whose lot he had been comparing to that of her sisters in the city, in the mills, the sweatshops, the big stores, and the streets. He had met her for the first time a few hours before, when his friend and classmate Jack Strawn had presented him to his sister. No comrade knew Drew better than Strawn, and no one admired him so much. Therefore, Gloria, ever seeking a closer contact with life, had come to West Point, eager to meet the lithe young Kentuckian and to measure him by the other men of her acquaintance. Yes, the sun shines south on my old Kentucky home. She was disappointed in his appearance, for she had fancied him almost godlike in both size and beauty, and she saw a man of medium height, slender but toughly knit, and with a strong but homely face. When he smiled and spoke, she forgot her disappointment, and her interest revived, for her sharp city sense caught the trail of a new experience. To Philip Drew, whose thought of and experience with women was almost nothing, so engrossed had he been in his studies, military and economic, Gloria seemed little more than a child. And yet her frank glance of appraisal when he had been introduced to her, and her easy, though somewhat languid conversation on the affairs of the commencement, perplexed and slightly annoyed him. He even felt some embarrassment in her presence. Child though he knew her to be, he hesitated whether he should call her by her given name, and was taken aback when she smilingly thanked him for doing so, with the assurance that she was often bored with the eternal conventionality of people in her social circle. Suddenly turning from the commonplaces of the day, Gloria looked directly at Philip, with easy self-possession turned the conversation to himself. "I'm wondering, Mr. Drew, why you came to West Point, and why it is you like the thought of being a soldier. An American soldier has to fight so seldom that I have heard that the insurance companies regard them as the best risks. So, what attraction, Mr. Drew, can a military career have for you?" "As far back as I can remember," he said, "I have wanted to be a soldier. I have no desire to destroy and kill, and yet there is within me the lust for action and battle. It is the primitive man in me, I suppose, but sobered and enlightened by civilization. I would do everything in my power to avert war and the suffering it entails. Fate, inclination, or what not has brought me here, and I hope my life may not be wasted, but that in God's own way I may be a humble instrument of good. Oftentimes our inclinations lead us in certain directions, and it is only afterwards that it seems as if fate may from the first have so determined it. So, you know, in God's own way, I may be a humble instrument for good. This is your basic Protestant, Southern, Presbyterian, Baptist idea of, I am going to be an instrument of good. So here we have Edwin Mandel House basically adopting a very basic Christian view of life, and that is that God is active and God can help you, and God will, if you are willing, make you into a humble instrument for good. "But suppose there is no war," she demanded. "Suppose you go on living in a barracks here and there, and with no broader outlook than such a life entails, will you be satisfied? Is that all you have in mind to do in the world?" "Gloria, we are entering a new era. The past is no longer to be a guide to the future. A century and a half ago there arose in France a giant that had slumbered for untold centuries. He knew he had suffered grievous wrongs, but he did not know how to right them. The giant, of course, is the people, the revolution in France. He therefore struck out blindly and cruelly, and the innocent went down with the guilty. He was almost wholly ignorant, for in the scheme of society as then constructed, the ruling few felt that he must be kept ignorant. Otherwise, they could not continue to hold him in bondage. For him, the door of opportunity was closed, and he struggled from the cradle to the grave for the minimum of food and clothing necessary to keep breath within the body. His labor and his very life itself was subject to the greed, the passion, and the caprice of his overlord. Is that not what Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum want for us? To return us to that state of having our very lives dependent upon working every day for the minimum amount of food and clothing necessary to stay alive. That was me. Back to the Edward, I'm back to Philip Drew's answer. So when he awoke, he could only destroy. Unfortunately for him, there was not one of the governing class who was big enough and humane enough to lend a guiding and a friendly hand. So he was led by weak and selfish men who could only incite him to further wanton murder and demolition. But out of that revelry of blood there dawned upon mankind the hope of a more splendid day. The divinity of kings, the God given right to rule, was shattered for all time. The giant at last knew his strength, and with head erect and the light of freedom in his eyes, he dared to assert the liberty, equality, and fraternity of man. Well, who's that? That's the rights of man, Lafayette, the French Freemasons. Then, throughout the Western world, one stratum of society and after another demanded and obtained the right to acquire wealth and to share in the government. Here and there, one bolder and more forceful than the rest acquired great wealth, and with it great power. Not satisfied with reasonable gain, they sought to multiply it beyond all bounds of need. They who had sprung from the people a short lifespan ago were now throttling individual effort and shackling the great movement for equal rights and equal opportunity. Okay, so Devil Bill Rockefeller, the John D. Rockefeller's father, was a traveling uh, uh, patent medicine salesman, who got into oil. And, in the next generation, you have John D. Rockefeller, who ostensibly, he got his money early, but it was not enough. And so he just proceeded and proceeded. And as you can see, Philip Drew does not like the Rockefeller model of uh, rising from, from the cart of a traveling salesman to a vicious um, businessman taking over the entire world's oil supply if he were successful. Not satisfied with reasonable gain, not at all. Drew's voice became tense and vibrant, and he talked in quick, sharp jerks. Quote, "Nowhere in the world is wealth more defiant and monopoly more insistent than in this mighty republic," he said. "And it is here that the next great battle for human emancipation will be fought and won. And from the blood and travail of an enlightened people, there will be born a spirit of love and brotherhood which will transform the world. And the star of Bethlehem, seen but darkly for 2,000 years, will shine again with a steady and effulgent glow." Okay, so he has a vision, and it's going to involve um, some conflict. The vision of Philip Drew, chapter 2. Long before Philip had finished speaking, Gloria saw that he had forgotten her presence. With glistening eyes and face aflame, he had talked on with such compelling force that she beheld in him the prophet of a new day. Well, it hadn't been that long since we had Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints, so why not expect a new prophet anytime? She sat very still, and then she reached out to touch his sleeve. "I think I understand how you feel now," she said. "I've been reared in a different atmosphere from you, and at home have heard only the other side, while at school they mostly evade the question. My father is one of the, quote, bold and forceful few, as perhaps you know, but he does not seem to me to want to harm anyone. He is kind to us and charitable too, as that word is commonly used, and I am sure he has done much good with his money." "I'm sorry, Gloria, if I've hurt you by what I said." "Oh, never mind, for I'm sure you're right," answered the girl. But Philip continued, quote, "Your father, I think, is not to blame. It is the system that is at fault. His struggle and his environment from childhood have blinded him to the truth. To those with whom he has come in contact, it has been the dollar and not the man that counted." Isn't that a poignant way to put it? It has been the dollar and not the man that counted. He has been schooled to think that capital can buy labor as it would machinery, the human equation not entering into it. He believes that it would be equivalent to confiscation for the state to say, quote, in regard to a corporation, labor, the state, and capital are important in the order named. In other words, corporations must be subordinate to the state, which is what I have been saying for years here on this station, on this channel. So you're starting to see why I like Philip Drew, right? He says all the right stuff, just like I would have said if I were able to make a speech on January 6th and try to influence, the media to try to understand what the real message of that crowd was. You would have a hard time making father see that, put in Gloria. Yes, continued Philip, from the dawn of the world until now, it has been the strong against the weak. At the first, in the Stone Age, it was brute strength that counted and controlled. Then those that ruled had the leisure to grow intellectually, and it gradually came about that the many, by long centuries of oppression, thought that the intellectual few had God-given powers to rule and to exact tribute from them to the extent of commanding every ounce of exertion of which their bodies were capable. Right. So that's why we need everybody to have a number and, tracking and bio measures and everything else has all got to be documented because the exertion of energy is something that the elite need to profit from. Exactly what he said here in this book in 1912. It was here, Gloria, that society began to form itself wrongly, and the result is the miserable travesty of today. Selfishness became the keynote, and to physical and mental strength was conceded everything that is desirable in life. Later, this mockery of justice, which was partly recognized, and it was acknowledged to be wrong, later this mockery of justice was partly recognized, and it was acknowledged to be wrong for the physically strong to despoil and destroy the physically weak. Even so, the time is now measurably near when it will be just as reprehensible for the mentally strong to hold in subjection the mentally weak and to force them to bear the grievous burdens which a misconceived civilization has imposed upon them. Gloria was now thoroughly interested, but smilingly belied it by saying, a history professor I had once lost his position for talking like that. Well, I know somebody that lost his YouTube channel for talking like that. That would be me. The young man barely recognized the interruption. Quote, the first gleam of hope came with the advent of Christ, he continued. So warped and tangled had become the minds of men that the meaning of Christ's teaching failed utterly to reach human comprehension. They accepted him as a religious teacher only so far as their selfish desires let them. They were willing to deny other gods and admit one creator of all things, but they split into fragments regarding the creeds and forms necessary to salvation. In the name of Christ, they committed atrocities that would put to blush the most benighted savages. Their very excesses in cruelty finally caused a revolution in feeling, and there was evolved the Christian religion of today, a religion almost wholly selfish and concerned almost entirely in the betterment of life after death. The girl regarded Philip for a second in silence, and then quietly asked, for the betterment of whose life after death? I was speaking of those who have carried on only the forms of religion. Wrapped in the sanctity of their own small circle, they feel that their tiny souls are safe and that they are following the example and precepts of Christ. The full splendor of Christ's love, the grandeur of his life and doctrine is to them a thing unknown. The infinite love, the sweet humility, the gentle charity, the subordination of self that the Master came to give, a cruel selfish, and ignorant world meant but little more to us today than it did to those to whom he gave it. And you have chosen a military career to say this, the girl said. To Philip, her comment came as something of a shock, for he was unprepared for these words spoken with such a depth of feeling. Gloria and Philip Drew spent most of graduation day together. He did not want to intrude among the relatives and friends of his classmates, and he was eager to continue his acquaintance with Gloria. To the girl, this serious minded youth who seemed so strangely out of tune with the blatantly military fanfare was a distinct novelty. At the final ball, she almost ignored the gallantries of the young officers in order that she might have opportunity to lead Drew on to further self revelation. The next day, in the hurry of packing and departure, he saw her only for an instant, but from her brother he learned that she planned a visit to the new post on the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass, where Jack Strawn and Philip were to be stationed after their vacation. Philip spent his leave before he went to the new post at his Kentucky home. He wanted to be with his father and mother and wanted to read and think, so he declined the many invitations to visit. His father was a sturdy farmer of fine natural sense, and with him Philip never tired of talking when both had leisure. Old William Drew had inherited nothing save a run-down, badly managed, heavily mortgaged farm that had been in the family for several generations. By hard work and strict economy, he had first built it up into a productive property and had then liquidated the indebtedness. So successful had he been that he was able to buy small farms for four of his sons and give professional education to the other three. He had accumulated nothing, for he had given as fast as he had made. But his was a serene and contented old age because of it. What was the hoarding of money or land in comparison to the satisfaction of seeing each son happy in the possession of a home and family? The ancestral farm he intended for Philip, youngest and best beloved, soldier though he was to be. All during that summer, Philip and his father discussed the ever growing unrest of the country and speculated when the crisis would come and how it would end. Finally, he left his home and all the associations clustered around it and turned his face toward Imperial, Texas, the field of his new endeavor. He reached Fort Magruder at the close of an autumn day. He thought he had never known such sweet, dry air. Just as the sun was sinking, he strolled to the bluff around which flowed the turbid waters of the Rio Grande and looked across at the gray hills of old Mexico. Autumn drifted into winter, and then with the blossoms of an early spring came Gloria. The fort was several miles from the station, and Jack and Philip were there to meet her. As they paced the little board platform, Jack was nervously happy over the thought of his sister's arrival and talked of his plans for entertaining her. Philip, on the other hand, held himself well in reserve and gave no outward indication of the deep emotion which stirred within him. At last the train came, and from one of the long string of Pullmans, Gloria alighted. She kissed her brother and greeted Philip cordially and asked him in a tone of banter how he enjoyed army life. Drew smiled and said, "Much better, Gloria, than you predicted I would." The baggage was stored away in the buckboard, and Gloria got in front with Philip, and they were off. It was early morning, and the dew was still on the soft mesquite grass. And as the Mustang ponies swiftly drew them over the prairie, it seemed to Gloria that she had awakened in fairyland. At the crest of a hill, Philip held the horses for a moment, and Gloria caught her breath as she saw the valley below. It looked as if some translucent lake had mirrored the sky. It was the countless blossoms of the Texas bluebonnet that lifted their slender stems toward the morning sun and hid the earth. Down into the valley they drove upon the most wonderfully woven carpet in all the world, Aladdin and his magic looms could never have woven such a fabric. A heavy, delicious perfume permeated the air, and with glistening eyes and parted lips, Gloria sat dumb in happy astonishment. They dipped into the rocky bed of a wet weather stream, climbed out of the canyon, and found themselves within the shadow of Fort Magruder. Gloria soon saw that the social distractions of the place had little call for Philip. She learned, too, that he had already won the profound respect and liking of her brother officers. Jack spoke of him in terms even more superlative than ever. He is a born leader of men, he declared, and he knows more about engineering and tactics than the colonel and all the rest of us put together. Hard student though he was, Gloria found him ever ready to devote himself to her, and their rides together over the boundless, flower-studded prairies were a never-ending joy. "Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it wonderful?" she would exclaim, and once she said, "But Philip, happy as I am, I ofttimes think of the reeking poverty in the great cities, and wish in some way they could share this with me." Philip looked at her questioningly, but made no reply. A visit that was meant for weeks transgressed upon the months, and still she lingered. One hot June morning found Gloria and Philip far in the hills of the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. They had started at dawn with the intention of breakfasting with the courtly old haciendado who frequently visited the post. Well, I'll summarize the next bit of the story because it's about how they get lost and something gets in his eyes and he starts to lose his vision. Um, because of the alkali that is all over the desert that they walk through. So his eyesight is menaced, and he, well, let's just skip forward to page 16, where it says, "In the morning, Gloria was almost her usual self, but Philip could see but faintly. As early as was possible, they started for Fort Magruder. His eyes were bandaged, and Gloria held the bridle of his horse and led him along the dusty trail. Then came days of anxiety, for the surgeon at the post saw serious trouble ahead for Philip. Gloria read to him and wrote for him, and in many ways was his hands and eyes. He in turn talked to her of the things that filled his mind. The betterment of man was an ever-present theme with them. It pleased him to trace for her the world's history from its early beginning, when it was all misty tradition, down to the uncertain centuries of early civilization to the present time. He talked with her of the untrustworthiness of the so-called history of today, although we had every facility for recording facts, and he pointed out how utterly unreliable it was when tradition was the only means of transmission. Mediocrity, he felt sure, had oftentimes been exalted to genius, and brilliant and patriotic exclamations attributed to great men were never uttered by them. Neither was it easy, he thought, to get a true historic picture of the human intellectual giant. Once again, you have this personification, right, of humanity, as in the French Revolution. Now it's the human intellectual giant. Is that the singularity? I hope not. As a rule, they were quite human, but people insisted upon idealizing them. Consequently, they became not themselves, but what the popular mind wanted them to be. He also dwelt on the part the demagogue and the incompetence play in retarding the advancement of the human race. Some leaders were honest, some were wise, and some were selfish, but it was seldom that the people would be led by wise, honest, and unselfish men. "There's always the demagogue to poison the mind of the people against such a man," he said, "and it is easily done because wisdom means moderation and honesty means truth. To be moderate and to tell the truth at all times and about all matters seldom pleases the masses." And isn't that the truth? I mean, that's, why our politicians are so removed from reality. They, in order to keep getting the vote and the campaign contributions, they become a character and not their true selves. All right, I'm going to skip forward some more because he's finally deciding, yes, that he needs to leave the army because he would just be a pensioner if he stayed, because without his eyesight he wouldn't be useful, and so he feels it's dishonorable for him to stay in the army. I cannot live on a pension indefinitely. I cannot bring myself to believe that it is honest to become a mendicant upon the bounty of the country. Now, isn't that also an old attitude of the proud Southern Midwestern, you know, honest Christian to say, no, I don't want welfare. I will take care of myself. Don't come around here giving me federal programs. I have pride. I am offended that you would actually think that I would suck from the public tip. I won't do it. That's a lot of that is that attitude of the Southern Christian responsible for themselves, even to the extent that if you enter into poverty, well, that's your fate. And perhaps there comes a time when you would accept charity, hopefully from a friend or somebody that knows you. But the idea of setting up a government program to hand out money based on bureaucratic, rules as opposed to a person's genuine need and desire for the assistance, well, that's one of the big differences between the Philip Drew mentality and the um, Wall Street liberal mentality. Chapter 4, The Supremacy of Mind. Officers and friends urged Philip to reconsider his determination of resigning, but once decided he could not be swerved from his purpose. Gloria persuaded him to go to New York with her in order to consult one of the leading oculists, that's the eye doctor, and arrangements were made immediately. On the last day but one, as they sat under their favorite fig tree, they talked much of Philip's future. Gloria had also been reading aloud Sir Oliver Lodge's Science and Immortality, and closing the book on the final chapter, asked what Philip thought of it. Although the book was written many years ago, even then the truth had begun to dawn upon the poets, seers, and scientific dreamers. The domination of mind, but faintly seen at the time, but more clearly now, will finally come into full vision. The materialists, under the leadership of Darwin, Huxley, and Wallace, went far in the right direction, but in trying to go to the very fountainhead of life, they came to a door which they could not open and which no materialistic key will ever open, unquote. Wow, what a sentence. They came to a door which they could not open and which no materialistic key will ever open. Well, isn't that exactly the the mad scientist's dream, is to unlock the key to life, to make life into something that you can rearrange like the blocks in the Lego set, that you can get into the building blocks of life and you can actually create the life that you think is needed despite what nature has developed. And that is exactly what's going on right now with this insane genetic manipulation. Because the philosophy of a Philip Drew is that no, you can't get there. We will never get to the basic building blocks of life because, well, we're part of life. It's kind of like How can you explain the fifth dimension to people that live in the third dimension? How can you know, how can you assume that you, a part of nature, are going to be able to figure out the entire scheme of nature? And this is where the Christian faith in Jesus and the Christian faith in God, and notice that Philip Drew is not a strict Calvinist in which he's saying, well, I'm saved and you're not. No, he is much more of a Baptist in the way it sounds to me. The Rockefellers, I believe, generally were Baptists. And that means that there is, in you the right to do good works and get saved that way. You're not necessarily excluded by the fact that you are predestined for heaven or hell. Reminds me so much of the old hymn that was sung at my grandmother's funeral in the garden. I walk through the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear coming to my ear, the Son of God discloses, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we linger there, none other has ever known. So I don't hate anybody. I don't hate Edwin Mandell House or Woodrow Wilson or, you know, Huxley and Galton and all of them. I mean, but they made a huge mistake in assuming that they could pierce through the very, very essence of life and thereby become gods themselves. And that is still the mentality. I mean, look at my show that I did about Francis Collins and his uh, version of Christianity. He claims to be a born again Christian, but he's really just a born again deist, a clockwinder God believer, where the idea of him and what's his name, the British guy, is it Dalton? Is that his name? That anyway, the one says an atheist, and the other one says no, I am a born again Christian. And but he's not a born again Christian like Philip Drew is talking about, having God in my heart, in my life, and Jesus uh, being able to help me get to heaven. He's not that kind of Christian at all. He's simply somebody that says, okay, well, this whole creation must have been done by God. But that's it. Now we are now the gods. We're now here to, he gave us the custody of the earth and the heavens and all right, that like the book says, but they take it too far. They take out the spiritual and the mystical and the who knows what else is involved in life that you can only find by going someplace in nature, perhaps. I've never seen the blue bonnets of Texas. That would be nice, but I do believe that when I get out into nature, I'm closer in a way to that real feeling of having a conversation a walk in the garden with God. All right. Thanks, guys. I will see you tomorrow for a live chat with you guys, and I look forward to that. Be sure and follow Mark and Nick and all the other great researchers. Uh, I recommend that you start always with Mark because he's at the tip of the spear on this question of right and wrong therapies and where they're really going with this stuff, but also to avoid all of the Pied Pipers that are going to lead you off into the wrong direction. So this is very serious work, and so don't let yourself be led astray. Thank you again.